There was a key that never left my mother's ring, long after the door it opened stopped being ours. A small brass key, worn smooth on one edge from her thumb. For years I thought it was sentiment, the way people keep a ticket stub or a dead watch. I didn't understand it was still being used. That's the boundary I need to tell you about first, because everything else only makes sense once you know it was never broken. In 11 years, Desmond Voss never once let himself be more to my mother than her late husband's best friend. Not in words. Not in public. Not even, I think, fully to himself. That was the line. He held it the entire time I wasn't watching. And I came home only because I thought I already knew the whole story. I should start with how it began, because the order matters, and because I spent a long time telling this story to myself in the wrong order, which is maybe why I got it wrong for so long. My name is Josephine Hartley, Jo, to anyone who's known me more than 5 minutes, and I was 26 the last time I lived in Millbrook, and 34 the week I came back. In between, I built a life in Chicago that looked, from the outside, like the kind of life you're supposed to want: a title at a mid-sized architecture firm, a rented loft with good light, a string of almost relationships I ended before they could ask too much of me. I left Millbrook the autumn after my father died, and I told everyone, including myself, that I left for the job. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth, and I want to tell this in order, so I'll get to the rest. My father, Thomas Hartley, ran a hardware store on Birch Street that his own father had started, the kind of place with creaking wood floors and a bell over the door and a back room that smelled like linseed oil. Desmond Voss had been his partner in it for almost 20 years, not a silent partner, a real one, the one who did the books and knew every supplier by first name and could fix anything with a pulse. They'd met in their 20s, 2 young men who couldn't have looked less alike, my father tall and easy and quick to laugh, Desmond compact and careful, a man who measured twice out of habit even when he didn't need to, and somehow that made them inseparable. Desmond was at our kitchen table more nights than not. He taught me to ride a bike in the lot behind the store. He was, in every way that mattered, family, long before anything happened that made the word complicated. My father died the spring I turned 26. An aneurysm, sudden, the kind of death that leaves no time to prepare and every reason to keep replaying the ordinary morning that preceded it. My mother, Eleanor, was 49. I remember thinking, in the fog of that year, that grief had made her smaller. She moved through the house like she was trying not to disturb it. And Desmond simply appeared, the way a person appears when they've already decided, without announcing it, that they are not going anywhere. He handled the store without being asked. He handled the funeral logistics my mother couldn't face. He sat with her on the porch some evenings and said almost nothing, and somehow that was the exact right amount to say. I noticed the shape of it even then, though I didn't have a name for it. There was a particular quality to how Desmond was around my mother that he wasn't around anyone else, a kind of attentiveness that stopped just short of anything you could point to. He'd notice she was cold before she said so and go get her sweater without making it a moment. He never touched her, not even the ordinary touches people allow themselves, a hand on a shoulder, an arm to hold on ice. It was as if he'd drawn a line around himself a half step back from where anyone else would stand, and simply stayed there, year after year, so precisely that you could almost forget the line existed. Almost. The store became the place where this all played out, because the store was where the two of them still had a reason to be near each other every day. My mother took over my father's half after he died. She'd always kept the accounts, she knew the business, and so she and Desmond ran it together the way they always had, except now there was no third person to absorb the space between them. I'd stop in most afternoons that first year, before I left for Chicago, ostensibly to help, mostly because I didn't know where else to put myself. I'd watch them work a register together, wordless, each anticipating the other's next move like people who'd done this for decades, which they had just never alone before. There was a ritual that started sometime that first winter, one I only recognized as a ritual because it repeated with such exactness. Every Thursday, Desmond closed the store 10 minutes early, walked 2 doors down to the bakery, and bought a loaf of the seeded rye my mother liked, the one she never bought for herself because she said it was an indulgence. He'd leave it on the counter without comment. She'd find it there and say nothing either, just put it away, and the next Thursday it would happen again. Nobody ever discussed it. It simply became load-bearing, the way certain small habits become load-bearing in a life, until you'd notice their absence more than you ever noticed their presence. The store itself deserves its own mention, because so much of what I'm telling you happened inside its particular geography. The narrow aisles of nails and hinges and paint chips, the back room with its smell of linseed oil and sawdust, the old brass bell my grandfather had hung over the door and that none of us, not even after 2 remodels, had ever once considered replacing. It was a small building on a street that had once been the busiest in Millbrook and had, by the time my father died, settled into a quieter, more residential rhythm, a bakery, a shuttered movie theater, a diner that still used the same laminated menus from the 90s. My father used to say the store didn't need to be big to be necessary, that a town remembers who fixed its pipes and its porches long after it forgets who owned the biggest building on Main. Desmond had believed that too, I think, with the same quiet conviction he brought to everything. It was the kind of business that survives on relationships more than margins, and the two of them had built exactly that kind of relationship with Millbrook, over 2 decades, 1 customer and 1 Thursday loaf of bread at a time. I used to sit on an overturned paint bucket near the register after school, doing homework, half listening to the two of them talk, not about anything important, usually. The weather. A customer's roof. Whether the hardware distributor in the next county had finally started stocking the good hinges. It was the ordinariness of it that I didn't understand the value of until much later, the way an entire private language can be built out of nothing but small, repeated, unremarkable exchanges, until the exchanges themselves become a kind of intimacy nobody bothers to name because naming it would somehow make it smaller. I want to be honest about something. For a long time I read all of this as something closer to friendship than anything else, because that was the label that let me not think about it too hard. It was easier. My mother had just lost her husband. The idea that she might, underneath the grief, also be the object of someone's careful, unspoken devotion, that was a thought I wasn't ready to sit with, so I didn't, not for a long time. The forbidden axis of this, if I can call it that, was never subtle, even if it was never spoken aloud. Desmond had been my father's closest friend for 2 decades. There is an entire unwritten code about what you do and do not do with your dead friend's widow, and Desmond seemed to have memorized it more thoroughly than anyone I'd ever met. It wasn't law. Nobody would have arrested him for holding my mother's hand at a funeral reception. But there's a difference between what's permitted and what's borne, and Desmond bore the difference like it was a job he'd taken on without being asked, and intended to do well. There were 3 small things from that first year I didn't understand the weight of until much later, though I noticed all of them at the time, the way you notice a splinter before you know it's under the skin. The bread on Thursdays was the first. The second was a chair, an old cane-backed chair that had been my father's, the one he always sat in behind the register, the one nobody else ever used. After he died, my mother left it exactly where it had always been, and for months, Desmond wouldn't sit in it either, even when his own back was clearly bothering him and every other chair in the store was occupied. He'd stand instead. The third was a phrase. My mother had a habit, when she was overwhelmed, of saying I can't think straight today, and every single time, without fail, Desmond would find some reason to take whatever task was in front of her and quietly do it himself, never remarking on it, never making her ask twice. The tension built the way tension builds when nobody is allowed to say what it is. I remember a Sunday dinner, maybe 8 months after my father died, when my mother's sister, my Aunt Ruth, visiting from 2 towns over, watched Desmond help clear the table with an ease that came from years of practice, and said, lightly, over her wine, "You two run that store like an old married couple." My mother laughed it off, a small, quick laugh, the kind that closes a door rather than opens one, and said something about it being easier with 2 sets of hands. Desmond didn't laugh at all. He just kept stacking plates, and I watched his jaw do something I didn't have a word for yet, and I thought, even then, he heard that the way you hear something you've already thought 1,000 times and never once let yourself finish. I asked my mother about it once, clumsily, the way you ask things at 26 when you think bluntness is the same as courage. We were doing dishes and I said something like, "Do you think Desmond has feelings for you?" And she went quiet in a way that told me more than any answer could have. Then she said, "Desmond was your father's best friend," as if that were the whole sentence, as if it answered the question instead of avoiding it. I didn't push. I've thought about that conversation more times than I can count since, turning over what she might have meant, and I still don't fully know. That's the honest answer. I have theories that she loved him and thought loving him would be a kind of betrayal, that she didn't let herself examine it closely enough to have an answer, that she knew exactly what it was and had simply decided, the way Desmond had, that some things don't get to happen even when they're true. I've never been sure which one is right. Maybe more than one was. There was another moment, a little later that same year, that I've never told anyone about, mostly because I wasn't sure what I'd witnessed until long after it happened. I'd come by the store one evening to drop off a casserole dish my mother had left there, and I found Desmond alone, closing up, standing very still in front of the calendar tacked to the wall behind the register, the same calendar my father had always kept, month after month, marking deliveries and appointments in his slanted handwriting. It was March. My father's birthday was the 14th. Desmond was looking at the date my father had written himself, months before he died, some small reminder about an order coming in, and his hand was resting flat against the page, not moving, like he was trying to feel something through the paper. He didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a full minute before I made a sound, and when he turned and saw me, he didn't try to explain it, and I didn't ask him to. We both understood, I think, that some grief doesn't need translating, and that whatever he'd been standing there working through had rooms in it neither of us was going to walk into out loud. My cousin Delphine, who worked the counter some Saturdays that first year, was the one who first said it to me directly, without my mother in the room to soften it. We were restocking shelves and she said, not unkindly, "You know he's in love with your mom, right? Everyone in town knows." I remember being furious at her for saying it so plainly, as though naming it were itself a kind of trespass, and I told her she didn't know what she was talking about. She just shrugged and said, "Maybe." But I've watched him hand her a cup of coffee every morning for 2 years without once letting their fingers touch. That's not nothing, Joe. That's a man being careful on purpose. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't, not really, except that she was right, and I think some part of me had known she was right for a long time and simply hadn't wanted the knowing to be confirmed by somebody else's mouth. The obstacle, when I finally understood it, wasn't a mystery or a secret kept from me, it was stated plainly enough, if you were paying attention, in the small and constant ways Desmond behaved like a man serving a sentence he'd handed down to himself. Once, at the store's 20th anniversary party, my father's death made it bittersweet, but my mother had insisted on holding it anyway, said Thomas would have wanted the store celebrated even if he couldn't be there for it. I watched Desmond stand near her for nearly the entire evening without once standing beside her. There is a difference, and I only learned to see it that night, near enough to be present, far enough that no one, including himself, could call it anything but proximity. At one point my mother stumbled slightly on the uneven porch step, and his hand came up fast, an instinct faster than the sentence he'd imposed on himself, and caught her elbow, and then, the second she was steady, he let go like he'd been burned, and stepped back to exactly the distance he'd been keeping all along. Later that same night, my mother told me, unprompted, in the kind of low voice people use for things they don't say twice, that Desmond had come to her about a year into the partnership with my father, decades earlier, some minor business dilemma, and my father had said to him, half joking, the way men joke about things they mean completely, "You're the only person I'd trust to look after my family if something happened to me." Desmond, she said, had never brought it up again, not once, in all the years since, but she believed, and I came to believe too, that he had taken it not as a joke but as an assignment, and had quietly, completely, organized the rest of his life around it. That was the boundary tested and held, right there in that one anecdote, a friend's dying wish, spoken half in jest years before either of them could have known it would matter, and Desmond treating it ever after like something sacred he had no right to complicate with his own wanting. There was one more scene from that period I should tell you, because it's the clearest example I have of the line being tested and held. It was late autumn, maybe a year and a half after my father died, and a storm had knocked out power across half of Millbrook overnight. My mother had been alone in the house when it happened, and Desmond, unable to reach her by phone, had driven over in the dark and found her sitting at the kitchen table by candlelight, calm but clearly shaken, the way a person is shaken by silence and darkness settling into a house that used to always have someone else in it. He stayed. He built a fire in the hearth my father had rarely used, made her tea on the gas stove, and the two of them sat up most of the night talking about nothing important, she told me later, the weather, the store. Old stories about my father that made them both laugh in a way that had grief folded somewhere inside the laughing. At some point, she said, exhaustion and the strange intimacy of candlelight had made her reach for his hand across the table, an unthinking gesture, the kind you make when you simply want to be less alone. And Desmond had let her hold it for exactly as long as it took her to fall asleep in the chair, and then, she told me, he had very gently withdrawn his hand, covered her with a blanket from the hall closet, and left before she woke, so that neither of them would ever have to discuss what the gesture had or hadn't meant. She found out the next morning, from a neighbor, that he'd walked the 2 miles home in the dark and the cold rather than wake her to ask for a ride. I asked her why she thought he'd done that, walked, rather than risk the 15 extra minutes it would have taken to rouse her. She said she'd asked herself the same question for years, and had finally decided the answer was simple. He hadn't trusted himself to be in a car alone with her in the dark, warm from sleep, without saying something he'd spend the rest of his life having said. So he'd chosen the cold instead, and the 2-mile walk, and the silence that let both of them wake up the next day in exactly the same place they'd been the night before. I left for Chicago not long after that anniversary party, and I told myself, as I said, that it was for the job, and it was, partly. But some of it, I understand now, was that I couldn't stand watching two people I loved hold themselves so carefully apart, couldn't stand the particular grief of watching restraint be someone's whole personality. I thought, at 26, that leaving was the same as moving on. I was wrong about that, the way you're often wrong about things at 26. 8 years passed the way years pass when you're building a life and calling it forward motion. I came home for holidays, dutifully, distractedly. I noticed, on those visits, that certain things had solidified rather than changed. The bread on Thursdays was still the bread on Thursdays. My father's chair was still empty, though Desmond had, at some point I couldn't pinpoint, started sitting in it, a shift I registered without understanding, and didn't ask about. My mother had, in that time, grown into a kind of quiet contentment that I mistook, from a distance, for simple peace, the natural settling of a woman who'd made her peace with widowhood. I didn't examine it closely. I had my own life to attend to, my own almost relationships to end before they asked too much of me, which is its own kind of avoidance I didn't recognize as related to any of this until much later. Chicago, in those years, was exactly the life I'd told myself I wanted, busy in the particular way that lets you postpone questions about yourself indefinitely. I dated a structural engineer for 2 years who wanted, eventually, to talk about moving in together, and I found reasons, one after another, to let the conversation stall, until he stopped bringing it up and, not long after, stopped calling altogether. I told my friends I simply hadn't met the right person. I told myself the same thing. It didn't occur to me, not for years, that I might have absorbed something from watching my mother and Desmond, some quiet lesson about how a person can love carefully enough, and at enough of a remove, that the loving never has to risk becoming a loss. I'm not proud of that. I'm only telling you because it's true, and because I think it matters to the rest of the story. I called home every Sunday, a habit I kept scrupulously even when I had little to report and less patience to hear about the store's supplier troubles or the town council's ongoing argument about the old theater. My mother's voice, over those years, took on a texture I associate now with a particular kind of settled happiness, unhurried, warm at the edges, the voice of someone who has stopped waiting for something and started simply living inside what she has. At the time I read it as resignation. I understand now it might have been the opposite. Desmond, on the rare occasions he'd get on the phone to say hello, always asked the same 3 questions, in the same order, like a small ritual of his own: how the work was going, whether I was eating properly, and whether I'd been outside that week, as if he could diagnose my whole state of mind through a telephone line if he asked the right questions carefully enough. I used to find it faintly comic. I understand now that it was its own kind of vigilance, extended even across 400 miles, even to a grown woman who hadn't asked for it and would have bristled if he'd called it what it was. The store changed hands, formally, when I was 31, not sold, but restructured, my mother stepping back from day-to-day operations as her health became a quieter, more constant concern, and Desmond taking on the full running of it, though he insisted, every time anyone asked, that it was still half hers, that nothing about the arrangement had changed. My visits home grew shorter and further apart. I told myself this was simply what happens to families, the natural erosion of proximity. I didn't ask myself why I flinched a little every time I thought about the 2 of them alone together in that house, growing older side by side, holding a line I'd started, somewhere in my 20s, to privately resent them both for holding. It was around this time that my mother sold my father's truck, an old, dependable pickup he'd driven for a decade, that she'd kept in the garage for 3 years after his death without once starting the engine. She told me, on the phone, that Desmond had been the one to finally say, gently, that it was all right to let it go, that keeping it wasn't keeping my father, and that he'd help her find it a good home rather than let it go to a stranger through the classifieds. He ended up selling it to a young mechanic 2 towns over who still, my mother told me years later, sent her a photograph every spring of the truck freshly waxed, sitting in his driveway, as though he understood without being told that it mattered to someone. That was such a Desmond thing to arrange, I thought at the time, without understanding yet how many other things, larger and quieter, he had also been arranging, all those years, just out of sight. The call that brought me back for good came on a Tuesday in March, from Aunt Ruth, not my mother. My mother's hands, Ruth said, had gotten too unsteady to manage a phone call she didn't want to have to make twice. A fall. Not catastrophic, but enough, a hip, a hospital stay. A doctor using the words "can't live alone" in the careful voice doctors use for sentences that end a certain kind of independence. I flew back within 2 days, expecting to stay a week, maybe 2, long enough to arrange care and go back to Chicago and the life I'd built. I ended up staying permanently, though I didn't know that yet, standing in the hospital hallway watching Desmond pace outside my mother's room with a coffee he wasn't drinking, wearing an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful blankness I remembered, but something closer to fear he couldn't quite discipline into stillness. It was in sorting through my mother's desk, that first week home, looking for insurance paperwork, that I found the ledger. It wasn't hidden, exactly, that's the part that unsettled me most, once I understood what I was looking at. It was in the bottom drawer, in a plain accordion folder labeled, in Desmond's small, careful handwriting, simply, house. Inside were receipts and statements going back nearly a decade. The mortgage on my parents' house, paid down faster than my mother's income from the store could ever have covered, in payments that traced back, month after month, to an account with Desmond's name on it. Medical bills from 3 years earlier, a cardiac scare my mother had never once mentioned to me, quietly settled. A payment, 5 years back, to my old university, that matched almost exactly a gap year's tuition I remembered scraping together myself through loans I was still, to that day, paying off, except the dates didn't match what I'd paid. They matched a semester I remembered nearly having to drop out for, the semester I'd told everyone I'd figured something out. I had never asked how. I had simply been relieved, and moved on, the way you move on from things you don't want to examine. I remember, very specifically, the moment my hands stopped moving through the papers and just held them instead, because I'd found a receipt from the semester I'd nearly dropped out of college, a wire transfer, dated 3 days before the tuition deadline. I remembered panicking over on the phone with the registrar's office, panicking so badly I'd cried in a stairwell and told no one, because I hadn't wanted my grieving mother carrying one more weight that year. I had told everyone afterward that I'd figured something out, a phrase I'd used so many times over the years that I'd half convinced myself it meant something specific, a scholarship, a payment plan, some resourcefulness on my own part one could take a small, private pride in. It meant nothing of the kind. It meant a man 3 states away, quietly moving money he could not entirely spare, so that a 20-year-old he loved like his own would never have to know how close she'd come to losing something she needed. I sat on the floor of my mother's study with that folder in my lap for a long time before I could make myself understand what it meant. My mother found me there. She didn't ask what I was looking at, she saw the folder and I watched something in her face give way, quietly, like a held breath finally let out. "He never wanted you to know," she said. "Any of it." I asked her why. I remember my voice not sounding like my own. She told me the story slowly, in pieces, the way people tell you things they've been holding so long the telling itself feels like a kind of undressing. After my father died, the store had struggled for nearly 2 years, a bad economy, a highway rerouted that used to bring foot traffic past the door, a series of bad seasons that had nearly closed them. My mother had never told me, because she hadn't wanted me carrying that particular weight in the same year I was carrying my father's death. Desmond had quietly covered the gap. Not as a loan, my mother was firm about that word, said he'd never once framed it as one, never once brought up repayment, not in 8 years. He'd taken on the debt, restructured his own finances, at one point, she told me, mortgaging a small piece of land his own family had left him, all without telling either of us, because, and here her voice caught, because he'd made a promise once, half in jest, to a man who could no longer hold him to it, and he'd decided the promise didn't come with an expiration date just because the man who asked for it was gone. "He loves you like his own," my mother said, "and he has never once let me forget that he thinks of it that way, as loving you like his own. Not like anything else. He was very careful about that. Always." And then, quieter, she said something I've turned over more times than almost anything else in this story. "I think it would have been easier for both of us if he'd let it be something else. I don't think it would have been kinder." I want to render the next part exactly as it happened, because I've replayed it so many times I trust the memory the way you trust something you've worn smooth with handling. I found Desmond at the store that evening, closing up, the bell above the door announcing me the way it had announced me 1,000 times as a girl. He looked up, and something in my face must have told him what I'd found, because he set down what he was holding very carefully, the way a person sets something down when their hands have started to shake and they don't want you to see it. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said. Not defensive. Just tired, in a way I'd never heard him. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Any of it. The tuition. The mortgage. Any of it." He was quiet for a long moment, running his thumb along the edge of the counter, an old habit I recognized from watching him work 1,000 transactions. "Because it wasn't a gift I wanted credit for," he said finally. "It was just the thing I was supposed to do. Your father asked me, once, to look after his family if he couldn't. I don't think he meant it as a real instruction. I think he meant it the way people mean things like that, as a compliment more than a plan. But he wasn't there to tell me which one he meant. So I did the one that made me able to sleep." I asked him, then, the question I'd carried since I was 26 and hadn't let myself ask anyone, including myself. I asked him if he loved my mother. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was very level, the way a person's voice goes level when they've decided, long ago, that levelness is the only way they're allowed to say a true thing. "I've loved your mother since before your father died," he said. "I loved her as his wife, and I have gone on loving her as his widow, and I made a decision a long time ago about what I was willing to let that mean. That decision hasn't changed. It isn't going to." He looked at me then, and there was something almost pleading in it, though his voice never lost its evenness. "I need you to understand that none of what I did, the house, the tuition, any of it, was ever a transaction. I never did it hoping it would earn me something with your mother. I did it because it needed doing, and I was the one who could do it, and I loved you both enough that there wasn't really a decision to make." I went back to my mother that same night and told her what he'd said. She was quiet for a long time, in her chair by the window, and then she told me something I don't think she'd ever said aloud to another living person. "I've known for years," she said. "I've known, and I've let it be what it is, because I think some things are more honest left unsaid than said. If he told me, I'd have to decide what to do with it. I'd have to decide what I feel, out loud, in a way I've never had to before. And I don't know that either of us wants that as much as we want this. Whatever this is. It's been enough." She paused. "Some days I think that's cowardice. Some days I think it's the kindest thing either of us has ever done for your father's memory. I go back and forth. I went to see my Aunt Ruth a few days later, mostly because I needed to talk to someone who wasn't standing at the center of it, and because some part of me suspected she already knew more than she'd ever let on at that dinner table years earlier, the night she'd made her joke about the old married couple. She wasn't surprised by any of it. She poured me tea I didn't drink and told me she'd watched the two of them for over a decade with a mixture of admiration and something close to grief on their behalf. "Your mother could have had him, you know," she said. "Any time she wanted. All she had to do was say the word, and I think Desmond would have laid down in traffic for the chance. But your mother has never in her life been the kind of woman who takes something just because it's offered. She wanted to be sure it was right, not just available. And I don't think she ever quite let herself get sure enough." She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "Grief does that to people. It makes them cautious about happiness in ways they never were before. I think your mother decided, somewhere along the way, that she'd already used up her allotment of great love, and anything after that would just be borrowing against a debt she didn't feel right taking on." I asked her if she thought that was true, that there's only so much love a person gets. She laughed, not unkindly, and said she thought it was the kind of lie grief tells you to keep you safe, and that safety and truth aren't always the same thing. I sat with those two conversations for weeks before anything else moved. I'd come home from Chicago with a plan for a 2-week visit and instead found myself unpacking boxes into my childhood bedroom, taking a remote position with a Chicago firm that let me stay, telling myself it was for my mother's recovery and knowing, underneath that, it was also because I couldn't leave this unfinished, this story I'd spent 8 years half avoiding, that had turned out to be so much larger and stranger and more careful than the small, easy version I'd been carrying around. The reckoning, when it came, wasn't dramatic. I think I'd expected, on some level, that finding out the truth would force something, a confession, a collapse of the careful distance, some scene out of the movies where restraint finally breaks because it's been named. That isn't what happened, and I've come to think that not happening was its own kind of answer. What changed was smaller and, I think, more honest. A few weeks after I found the ledger, my mother was well enough to come down to the store for the first time since her fall, moving slowly on a cane, and Desmond met her at the door and offered his arm without a second's hesitation, the way he never had before. Not once, not even at the anniversary party, not even the night she'd stumbled on the porch step. She took it. Neither of them said anything about what that meant. They didn't have to. I was standing by the register, exactly where I'd stood 100 times as a girl watching the two of them move around each other, and I watched my father's old chair, and I watched Desmond walk my mother past it, slow and steady, his arm under hers the whole way, and something in the shape of the two of them together looked, for the first time in 11 years, less like restraint and more like rest. I asked Desmond, some weeks later, whether he ever thought about what might have happened if he'd let himself say any of it out loud, years ago, before I'd found the ledger, before any of this came to light. We were in the back room of the store, doing inventory, a task I'd started helping with without quite deciding to. He thought about the question for a long time before he answered. "I think about it," he said. "I won't tell you I don't. But I've come to believe some kinds of love aren't diminished by staying quiet. I think mine would have been if I'd said it. It would have turned into a different thing, a claim, maybe, or a question she'd have felt obligated to answer one way or another. I didn't want to ask her to answer anything. I wanted her to be free of it. I still do." He set down the clipboard he was holding. "Your father asked me to look after you both. He didn't ask me to replace him. I've tried very hard, all these years, to know the difference, even when it would have been easier not to. A few months into my staying, I finally asked my mother the question I'd been circling since the ledger, phrased more carefully this time than the clumsy version I'd asked at 26. I asked her if she could go back, whether she'd have wanted him to say it, the whole of it, out loud years ago, before either of them had settled so completely into this careful, undeclared shape. She thought about it longer than I expected. I used to think so, she said. I used to lie awake some nights wanting him to just say it, so I could stop guessing. But I've come to think the guessing was its own kind of gift. It meant I got to choose him again every single day, instead of once, and then just living inside that one choice out of habit. There's something in that I wouldn't trade now, even if I could. She reached over and took my hand, which she rarely did. I know that probably sounds like something I invented to make the waiting bearable. Maybe it is. But it's also true. Both things can be true at once. You'll understand that better the older you get. I don't know, even now, exactly what my mother and Desmond are to each other, in the language most people would want me to use. They aren't a couple, not by any definition either of them would claim. They still keep the bread on Thursdays. He still, as far as I know, has never once told her outright what I already knew he felt, though I think she knows it as surely as I do, and I think that not saying has become, for both of them, its own kind of vow, one they renew, quietly, every single ordinary day they choose each other's company over anyone else's. I used to think that was sad. I've come to think it might be one of the most faithful things I've ever witnessed, a devotion that asked for nothing back, that didn't need to be named to be real, that simply kept showing up, year after year, in a chair, in a loaf of bread, in a mortgage paid without a signature required. As for me, I stayed. Not because anything was resolved in the way stories are supposed to resolve, but because I finally understood what I'd been running from at 26, watching the two of them hold themselves apart. I think I'd mistaken restraint for a kind of failure, a story that hadn't finished happening. I don't think that anymore. I think some stories are whole exactly as they are, mid-sentence, and asking them to finish would only ruin them. I took a permanent position at a firm 2 towns over. I help at the store on weekends, in the chair that used to be my father's, that Desmond finally, quietly, let himself sit in. And some Thursday evenings, when the bread appears on the counter the way it always has, I watch my mother find it there, and say nothing, and put it carefully away, and I understand, now, that the silence isn't an absence of an answer. It is the answer. It always was. I think, in the end, that's what nobody tells you about love that never gets to say its own name, that not saying it doesn't mean it wasn't real, or wasn't enough. Sometimes the most devoted thing a person can do is protect what they love by never once asking it to become something it wasn't ready to be. I came home expecting to find a family in need of managing. I found, instead, a family that had been quietly, faithfully looked after for 11 years by a man who never once asked for the credit, or the claim, or the name for what he felt, and a mother who let herself be loved that way because some truths, held gently enough, for long enough, become their own kind of shelter. I think about that ledger sometimes, still tucked in the bottom drawer of my mother's desk, in that same accordion folder marked house in Desmond's careful handwriting, a record of a decade of quiet keeping, never meant to be read by the people it was keeping safe. I used to think discovering it would feel like an ending, the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt like a beginning, the start of understanding my own family not as the small, settled thing I'd grown up believing it to be, but as something larger and stranger and more patient than I'd given it credit for, held together, all those years, not by declarations, but by a man who decided, quietly, that love could be a verb you practiced instead of a word you said, and by a woman brave enough to let herself be loved that way without ever needing to call it by its name. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.